What if the most dangerous secret in the modern royal era wasn't hidden in a vault, but in a lab result? Not shouted, not leaked, not even whispered at first. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just a thin envelope. White. Ordinary. Sitting on a table in a quiet room where no cameras were allowed. And what if opening that envelope didn't just change a marriage, but erased an entire future? That's the question at the heart of this fictional dramatization. Not a report, not a claim, a story, a what if, that explores how fragile trust really is when identity, legacy, and love collide. Because here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't like to admit. Secrets don't destroy families. The moment they're revealed does. Imagine a man who already walked away from everything he was born into. Titles, protocol, history. Imagine someone who gave up palaces for privacy, certainty for chaos, and tradition for love. Now imagine that same man discovering that the one thing he thought was untouchable wasn't. This is not about royalty. Not really. It's about betrayal. It's about doubt. And it's about what happens when the story you've told yourself for years suddenly collapses under the weight of a single piece of paper. Ask yourself something honestly. If everything else in your life had already been stripped away, how much truth could you survive? That's where our story begins. Not with headlines, not with crowds, but with silence. The kind of silence that feels louder than any argument. In this fictional world, Prince Harry is no longer fighting the monarchy. He's fighting something far more personal, something far more terrifying. Uncertainty. For years, his life had been defined by questions he never asked out loud. About loyalty. About manipulation. About whether love alone is enough to survive relentless pressure. And pressure changes people. It compresses them. It reshapes them. Sometimes, it cracks them open. There's a strange thing that happens when you step away from an institution that's defined you since birth. You expect freedom, relief, peace. But what you often get instead is time. Time to think. Time to replay conversations. Time to notice inconsistencies you once ignored because life was moving too fast. In this story, that time becomes dangerous. Because doubt doesn't arrive like a thunderstorm. It arrives like a drip. Slow, persistent, almost polite. At first, it's nothing. A thought dismissed. A question laughed off. Then it comes back. Why was that moment avoided? Why was that detail never clarified? Why does this explanation change depending on who's asking? These aren't accusations. They're irritations. Tiny grains of sand inside a shoe. You can walk with them for a while. But eventually, you have to stop. And that's what happens here. In this fictional scenario, the decision to seek answers doesn't come from anger. It comes from exhaustion. From a desire to finally silence the voice that keeps asking, what if? Because doubt, left alone, grows. And when you love someone, truly love them, doubt is the one thing you're not supposed to feel. That contradiction alone is enough to drive a wedge into even the strongest bond. Now pause for a moment and think about this. How many relationships have collapsed not because of lies, but because of unanswered questions? People don't always need the truth to be ugly. They just need it to be unclear. In our story, Harry isn't hunting for a scandal. He's hunting for certainty. The kind that lets you sleep through the night without replaying conversations from 5 years ago. And here's where the tension deepens. Because the act of asking for proof is, in itself, an accusation. Once you cross that line, there is no undo button. You can't unask a question like this. And that's why this story matters now. Not because of who the characters are, but because of what they represent. A world obsessed with lineage. A culture addicted to exposure. A society that believes every mystery deserves to be solved, no matter the cost. We live in an era where privacy is treated like guilt and silence is interpreted as deception. And in that environment, secrets don't stand a chance. But some truths, maybe they shouldn't. This fictional dramatization isn't asking you to believe anything. It's asking you to feel something. The anxiety of waiting. The dread of confirmation. The quiet terror of knowing that whatever comes next will be irreversible. Because once you seek proof, you're no longer protecting the relationship. You're preparing for its possible end. And that's where the envelope comes in. Not delivered by drama. Not accompanied by music. Just placed. Ordinary. Unassuming. The kind of object that shouldn't have the power to dismantle an entire life. But it does. Because inside it isn't just data. Its implication. Implication about identity, about honesty, about whether love was built on truth or convenience. In this story, no one storms out immediately. No one screams. No one throws anything. That comes later. First, there's denial. Then rationalization. Then the moment every human fears most. Recognition. That split second where your mind catches up with what your eyes already know. And when that happens, everything you thought was solid starts to feel hollow. Here's the contradiction that sits at the center of this tale. The search for truth is supposed to bring peace. But what if it brings isolation instead? What if knowing doesn't heal, but severs? That's the emotional question driving this entire narrative. And as we move forward, you'll see how a single decision sets off a chain reaction. How one moment of doubt becomes a point of no return. You'll see conversations replayed in a new light, gestures reinterpreted, promises quietly reevaluated. Because once trust fractures, even love starts to sound like a performance. And maybe the most painful part isn't discovering something new. It's realizing you'll never be able to see the past the same way again. This introduction isn't about revealing anything. It's about setting the emotional trap. Because the real story doesn't begin with the result. It begins with the choice to look. And as you'll soon see, that choice doesn't just affect one person. It pulls everyone into its gravity. Partners, children, history itself. So before we go any further, ask yourself one last question. If the truth threatened to destroy everything you love, would you still want to know it? Because in the next section, we step into the moment where that question stops being hypothetical. The envelope is opened, and what comes next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Some truths arrive quietly, almost imperceptibly. No fanfare, no warning, just a small, ordinary object sitting on a desk that, in an instant, has the power to rewrite everything you thought you knew. In this fictional scenario, that object was an envelope. White, unassuming, almost banal. But it held within it a secret that would ripple through every corner of a life already fractured by doubt, expectation, and relentless scrutiny. It wasn't the kind of envelope anyone expected to have significance. There were no bold letters screaming confidential, no wax seal reminiscent of some secret society. Just paper, just potential. And yet, the weight it carried was enormous. Because what it contained wasn't mere paperwork. It was something much more dangerous. Information about identity, lineage, and the foundation of trust itself. Imagine being in a room, alone. The world outside is loud, opinionated, invasive. Reporters, photographers, social media speculation, all swirling around your name like a storm you can't control. And yet, in this quiet, sunlit room, you are faced with one choice. Open it, or leave it sealed. Both options come with consequences. Both options are irreversible. Our fictional protagonist, Harry, stared at the envelope for what felt like hours, although only minutes had passed. Every nerve in his body was screaming both to reach for it and to walk away. It's a peculiar tension, the instinct to uncover the truth clashing with the fear of what that truth might mean. The envelope had been delivered in the early morning, left neatly on a small mahogany table in the guest room, a neutral space, away from the chaos of cameras, staff, and expectation. It was a deliberate placement, almost ceremonial, as if someone, or something, wanted the discovery to be intimate, private, inescapably personal. Questions swirled in his mind. Who sent it? Why now? Why not earlier? But these questions were secondary to the one that pulsed louder with every heartbeat. What would he find inside? He was no stranger to secrets. Years of royal life, public exposure, and constant scrutiny had taught him to expect deception, to anticipate misdirection, to question motives. And yet, nothing had prepared him for the raw, paralyzing terror of holding undeniable truth in his hands. The room itself seemed to respond to the tension. The sunlight shifted across the floorboards, shadows stretching unnaturally. Outside, birds sang obliviously. The juxtaposition of normalcy with the seismic weight of potential revelation created a surreal, almost cinematic tension. This is the moment before the storm, the calm before everything changes. And Harry, in this fictionalized world, knew it. Deep down, he knew that once the envelope was opened, there would be no turning back. He picked it up with deliberate caution, fingers trembling slightly, heart hammering against the ribcage as though trying to escape. He turned the envelope over in his hands, weighing the possibility of regret. Because that's what it was, regret. The kind that waits patiently, always at the edge of a decision, whispering that one wrong move could irreversibly shatter lives. But at the same time, there was a magnetic pull, a need for clarity, certainty, even at the cost of comfort. Humans are wired to seek answers, even when those answers hurt, even when they may ruin everything. This tension, this duality, is central to our story. Curiosity versus caution, love versus suspicion, security versus exposure. And at the heart of it, a man trying to reconcile his desire for truth with the fear of its consequences. The envelope opened with a slow, deliberate motion, almost ritualistic. The paper inside was crisp, folded neatly. A document, yes, but also a symbol. A tangible representation of the unknown. Harry's eyes scanned the contents carefully, absorbing each word, each number, each implication. And as he did, the familiar walls of certainty began to crumble. What he saw, or rather, what he interpreted, was enough to send a shiver through him. The moment was surreal, the air thick, the world narrowing down to the two hands holding the revelation, the mind racing with interpretations, the heart refusing to beat normally. It's difficult to describe that exact second when comprehension hits. When you realize that something you once took for granted, trust, loyalty, love, is now under scrutiny. It's a second filled with cognitive dissonance, the brain struggling to reconcile past beliefs with current reality. And as Harry processed the information, a cascade of memories surged through him. Conversations, gestures, offhand comments, subtle inconsistencies he had once ignored. The document, though factual in its presentation, became a lens through which he viewed everything differently. And here's a critical point for the audience. It's not the document itself that is powerful. It's the interpretation, the emotional charge, the human reaction to information that has the potential to destabilize entire relationships. It's the emotional gravity, the way it bends perception, twists memories, and reframes the past. In stories of trust and betrayal, it's rarely the fact alone that causes collapse. It's the combination of fact, timing, and emotional resonance. Harry sat back in the chair, breath shallow. He knew what he was holding was more than data. It was a detonator. A single piece of paper capable of creating fissures in relationships that had taken years to build. And yet, he also recognized a certain inevitability. Secrets, he realized, are rarely permanent. They surface in one form or another. Sometimes quietly as here. Sometimes loudly, with public spectacle. But they always surface. This leads to an uncomfortable reflection. The choice to seek truth is never neutral. By opening the envelope, Harry crossed an invisible threshold. One that, once crossed, alters the trajectory of every relationship involved. In the space of a few minutes, certainty transforms into doubt. Familiarity becomes suspicion. Love is suddenly filtered through a lens of what if, what was, and what might have been. The internal conflict is palpable. On one hand, there is a desire for resolution, a wish to understand, to contextualize, to put the puzzle together. On the other, there is a paralyzing fear. What if the truth is incompatible with the life he has built? What if knowing the answer undermines the very foundation of his personal reality? The human psyche is cruel in such moments, amplifying doubts, exaggerating potential consequences, and forcing impossible decisions. And the stakes, in this fictional story, are enormous. Not merely personal, but emotional, relational, and psychological. The envelope's contents challenge not only perception, but also identity. They force Harry to question the narratives he has long relied upon, about family, loyalty, love, and integrity. The tension escalates with each line read, each realization processed. The emotional weight is almost unbearable, yet unavoidable. In this calm, suspended moment, there is also a broader reflection on human nature. Why are we drawn to secrets? Why does the idea of hidden knowledge, forbidden information, carry such magnetic force? Partly, it's curiosity, an innate drive to resolve uncertainty. Partly, it's fear that what we don't know might be catastrophic. and partly, it's power. To know something others do not is to hold influence, insight, control. In this fictionalized story, all three elements converge, creating a perfect storm of emotional tension. And then comes the moment we all dread, the realization that once information is acknowledged, it cannot be ignored. Harry cannot unsee what he has seen. He cannot unread what he has read. The envelope has done its work. The seed of doubt has been planted. The first domino has fallen. At this point, he senses that the next steps will define everything. Any action taken, or not taken, will ripple outward, affecting not just him but those closest to him. Relationships, trust, even the perception of self are all now subject to scrutiny. And in the silence of that room, with the envelope still resting on his lap, the weight of inevitability presses down. As viewers, it's important to pause and consider the emotional dynamics at play. This is not about scandal. Not yet. It's about the human experience of facing information that destabilizes what one believes to be secure. It's about tension, anticipation, and the moral quandary of truth versus stability. It's about the intersection of knowledge and consequence. And just as tension peaks, just as the audience is hanging on every imagined heartbeat, the scene pauses. Not with revelation, but with anticipation. Because the real drama is about to unfold, beyond the envelope, beyond the paper, in the actions and reactions that follow. The first move has been made. The board has been set, and the next chapter is coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The decision to seek answers is rarely simple. In this fictional scenario, Harry didn't wake up one morning and impulsively decide to request a test. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was exhaustion, the quiet, gnawing kind that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. Years of tension, of subtle inconsistencies, of questions that were too easily dismissed, had accumulated into a weight that demanded resolution. Imagine carrying around doubt like a shadow. It isn't a constant scream, it's a whisper in the background. A flicker in conversations, a hesitation in tone, a glance that doesn't quite match the words spoken. At first, you ignore it. You tell yourself it's paranoia. You chalk it up to stress, fatigue, or misinterpretation. But over time, those whispers grow louder. And eventually, they become impossible to ignore. Harry's fictional motivation, in this story, was a desire to reconcile the past with the present, to have clarity about decisions he had already made. The world saw him as a man who walked away from the monarchy, who defied tradition, who risked everything for love and independence. But even independence comes at a cost. The freedom he sought was tainted by lingering questions about loyalty, honesty, and the hidden truths of the people closest to him. This isn't a tale of obsession. It's a story about human nature. Curiosity is a double-edged sword. It drives discovery. It fuels innovation. But in the intimate corridors of family and love, curiosity can be terrifying. The desire to know, to see, to confirm, collides with the fear of what confirmation might bring. In this fictional account, Harry remembered moments that didn't sit right with him, conversations that seemed rehearsed, explanations that didn't add up, gestures that hinted at something withheld. He replayed them over and over, analyzing tone, context, and subtext. The mind becomes a relentless detective in such situations, hunting for patterns, looking for evidence, even when there may be none. And the test, whatever its content, represented more than data. It represented certainty. A chance to silence the gnawing doubt that had shadowed him for years. Because living with uncertainty is exhausting. Every decision, every word, every interaction becomes filtered through suspicion. Every smile becomes suspect. Every gesture questioned. And no matter how much you try to push it aside, the mind doesn't forget. It only stores, ready to explode at the slightest trigger. It's worth pausing here to reflect on the psychology of doubt. Humans are wired to seek patterns, to interpret signals, to infer meaning. When a person suspects deception, even subtly, the brain magnifies inconsistencies, creating a feedback loop that reinforces suspicion. What starts as a minor irritation can escalate into full-blown anxiety, leading to actions that might seem extreme from the outside. In this fictional scenario, requesting the test wasn't extreme, it was a desperate bid for peace of mind. But what makes this story compelling isn't just the desire for truth. It's the internal conflict that arises from seeking it. To ask for proof is, in itself, a form of accusation. It implies that trust is insufficient. It signals doubt, and doubt, even when justified, carries consequences. Every relationship has a threshold for questioning, a point beyond which even well-intentioned inquiries can feel like betrayal. In this narrative, Harry is acutely aware of that threshold. He doesn't want to accuse. He wants clarity. He wants certainty. And yet, he knows that seeking confirmation could irreversibly alter the dynamic between him and the people involved. It's a risk, and one that weighs heavily on him. Consider for a moment the emotional tension at play. This is not a story about revelation alone. It's about the journey to revelation. The anticipation, the fear, the deliberation, the internal debate. All of it creates a rich tapestry of psychological complexity. Every step toward the test is fraught with stakes, not just factual, but moral and emotional. Harry's fictional journey to request the test involved subtle planning. He had to ensure discretion, privacy, timing. The delivery of the envelope, as described earlier, was part of that orchestration. It had to be placed where he could confront it alone, without interruption or influence. The act of receiving information in private amplifies its emotional impact. Alone, a person is forced to process, reflect, and react without external guidance, without the softening effect of shared interpretation. As the narrative unfolds, we see that Harry's motivation is multifaceted. It is curiosity, yes, but also responsibility. Responsibility to himself, to his sense of reality, to the truth he feels entitled to understand. It is love, too, not the romanticized version, but the deep, complex form that demands honesty even when honesty is painful. To seek clarity is an act of care, paradoxically, because it protects against further harm caused by ignorance. Humor, in this tension-filled context, emerges subtly, not slapstick or overt, but the kind that arises from human absurdity. The human mind, confronted with the inevitability of confrontation, often imagines unlikely scenarios, ridiculous outcomes, or ironic twists. In this story, Harry imagines conversations going wrong, miscommunications spiraling, or absurd misunderstandings magnified by the weight of secrecy. These flashes of humor provide brief relief, but also deepen the realism of the emotional landscape. And as he awaits the envelope, as he waits for confirmation, there is anticipation, bordering on dread. The human body responds physiologically. Heart rate quickens, hands tremble, breath shortens. Cognitive processing becomes hyper-focused. The world narrows to the central issue, the answer to the question that has haunted him for years. But here's the paradox. The very act of seeking certainty guarantees disruption. The mind cannot predict emotional fallout. Trust, once challenged, cannot be easily restored. Relationships, once filtered through the lens of doubt, are never the same. And so, the desire for clarity exists alongside the fear of what clarity might bring, a duality that creates the central tension of the story. It's in this delicate, precarious balance that the fictional drama thrives. Readers, or viewers, are invited to inhabit the mind of someone grappling with profound questions, someone at the intersection of love, doubt, and obligation. It's relatable because, on some level, everyone has faced moments where they had to confront the possibility that someone they trusted might not be entirely truthful. The stakes in this story are higher, yes, but the emotional resonance is universal. As Harry reaches for the envelope, the psychological mechanics of decision-making come into sharp focus. The mind oscillates between approach and avoidance. Rational analysis battles emotional impulse. Fear and desire become indistinguishable. And in that moment, the choice to confront the unknown is made, not lightly, not casually, but deliberately, as an act of agency in a world otherwise defined by forces beyond his control. And yet, even with the choice made, the narrative tension is far from resolved. The act of opening the envelope is merely a precursor to the real drama, the emotional, relational, and psychological fallout that follows. Because in stories of trust, betrayal, and revelation, the impact is never immediate and straightforward. It unfolds in layers: shock, disbelief, reinterpretation, confrontation, and ultimately, transformation. As the chapter closes, we are left at a pivotal moment. The threshold has been crossed. The decision to seek the truth has been enacted. The envelope, now in hand, is a harbinger of the challenges to come. The audience is left to imagine the possibilities, to consider the emotional stakes, and to anticipate the dramatic confrontations that are inevitable once the truth, however partial or ambiguous, is confronted. But what came next would test every assumption, every bond, and every shred of resilience, forcing Harry to confront not only others, but himself. The envelope had been opened. The moment of decision had passed. But the story wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. What lay inside wasn't just a document. In this fictionalized drama, it was a portal, a window into truths that had been suspected, hinted at, but never confirmed. It was a revelation that demanded processing, reflection, and, most painfully, confrontation. Harry stared at the contents, the crisp folds of paper in his hands suddenly heavy with significance. At first, there was disbelief. A subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of the chest. A catch in the throat. The mind works in strange ways when confronted with something that challenges everything it thought it knew. It oscillates between denial and acceptance, between reason and fear, between the life that was imagined and the life that suddenly seems inevitable. Disbelief is the first emotional spike in moments like these. The brain cannot immediately reconcile the familiar narrative with the new data. Memories, conversations, gestures, all are reevaluated in light of the revelation. In this fictional scenario, Harry replayed moments in his mind that once seemed ordinary. A glance, a hesitation, a phrase casually dismissed. Suddenly, every detail became suspect. The human mind has a remarkable capacity for retroactive reinterpretation. What was once neutral can suddenly feel like foreshadowing. But as the initial shock faded, comprehension set in. The numbers, the words, the implications, they weren't what he expected. The revelation didn't fit neatly into existing assumptions. That's part of the terror. Not that the truth is ugly, but that it doesn't align with what you thought you understood. Humans crave narrative coherence. When facts refuse to fit, it triggers cognitive dissonance, a deep discomfort that demands resolution but offers none. In this fictional account, the result catalyzed a wave of emotional turbulence. Confusion, anger, sadness, relief, strangely. Relief because doubt, even painful, had finally been answered. But also fear. What does one do with a truth so destabilizing? The emotional spectrum stretches and contracts wildly in these moments. 1 minute, clarity seems liberating. The next, it feels like a chain wrapped tightly around the chest. There's also an element of isolation. While the revelation concerns multiple people, the initial processing is profoundly solitary. No one else can interpret your internal response. No one can feel the exact combination of shock, betrayal, and rationalization. In this moment, Harry is alone with the truth, and that solitude amplifies its power. It becomes larger than life, looming over every memory, every expectation, every plan. Interestingly, the human reaction to unexpected results is often nonlinear. There is a jumpy, almost erratic pattern. A thought emerges, then recedes. A memory surfaces, then fades. The emotional brain reacts faster than the rational brain can process. In this narrative, Harry finds himself simultaneously analyzing, imagining, fearing, and hoping, sometimes all at once. The complexity of this emotional state is what makes the story gripping. The audience feels tension not just from what is revealed, but from how the character grapples with it internally. And yet, even as the content of the envelope is absorbed, questions multiply. How could this have gone unnoticed? Why were the signs overlooked before? What does this mean for the people he loves? The human need for narrative closure pushes him to ask questions that may have no answers. This is the cruel paradox of truth. The moment it is revealed, the mind instinctively wants to contextualize, rationalize, and integrate. But sometimes, the truth defies integration. It resists being absorbed into the framework of life as previously understood. In addition to psychological complexity, there's a physical dimension to such moments. Heart races, hands tremble, breathing becomes shallow. A person may feel both lightheaded and hyper-aware simultaneously. These physiological responses mirror the inner turmoil, enhancing the drama. In our fictional dramatization, Harry experiences these responses in full force, underscoring the intensity of the revelation. But this chapter is about more than internal reaction. It's also about anticipation. The audience knows that revelation is rarely private for long. Information has a way of pressing against reality until it must be acknowledged externally. And in this narrative, the envelope's contents are a ticking time bomb. They demand action. They compel a response. The question emerges, what next? Do you confront? Withdraw? Seek counsel? Each option carries risk. Each has the potential to escalate or mitigate fallout. The decision-making process is fraught, and every choice is weighted with consequence. This is the core tension of the chapter. Understanding the revelation is only the first step. How to respond is the true challenge. It's in this juncture that anticipation builds. The audience, like Harry, is caught between comprehension and action. They feel the suspense, the uncertainty, the dread of the unknown. This is where retention peaks. The combination of emotional intensity, relatable human reaction, and high stakes keeps viewers engaged. They are invested in what will happen next, not merely in what has already been revealed. As he reviews the content, Harry begins to connect dots that were previously isolated. Gestures, comments, subtle inconsistencies, patterns emerge that suggest context beyond what is immediately apparent. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine, and under stress, it often finds patterns with remarkable speed. But pattern recognition can also mislead. It can generate false narratives that feel true, adding layers of complexity and tension to the story. And then comes the inevitable cognitive reckoning, the realization that life has shifted in an irreversible way. Even if nothing is said aloud, even if external circumstances remain unchanged, the internal world has been altered. Thoughts cannot be unthought. Emotions cannot be unexperienced. This is the heart of the drama, the irreversible transformation that makes every subsequent action, conversation, and decision charged with newfound significance. In this fictional tale, the next logical step, though delayed for dramatic tension, is confrontation. Someone must hear the truth. Someone must respond. But anticipation builds because, as any audience knows, confrontation is unpredictable. It carries risk of escalation, misinterpretation, and emotional collision. The envelope has set the stage, and now the actors are forced to step into the light. Before that confrontation occurs, however, there is a crucial pause, a moment to absorb, reflect, and anticipate. This is where suspense is maximized. The envelope is no longer a passive object. It is a catalyst, a pivot point, a force that shapes the narrative trajectory. Harry's mind races with possibilities, plotting potential conversations, anticipating reactions, imagining outcomes. The emotional landscape is dense, layered, and charged. And as this chapter draws to a close, we arrive at the defining moment, the recognition that the revelation is only the beginning. Understanding what has been revealed is one thing. Deciding what to do with it is another. And the weight of that decision will test every bond, every conviction, every shred of resilience. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. While Harry sat in quiet shock, processing the implications of the envelope's contents, Meghan's fictional perspective unfolded in parallel, though in a different emotional register. Unlike Harry, who had approached the situation with a mix of curiosity, dread, and rational anticipation, she was caught in the tangled web of guilt, fear, and instinctual self-preservation. The human mind, when faced with exposure, often oscillates between justification and panic. This fictional narrative explores that oscillation, capturing the emotional turbulence that defined her internal world in this imagined scenario. It began with a simple awareness, the knowledge that something long held secret could no longer remain contained. The envelope was not just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of accountability, a mirror reflecting choices that could no longer be hidden. In Meghan's mind, the anticipation of its discovery was as suffocating as the actual revelation. The irony is profound. Secrecy, meant to protect, often generates the very vulnerability it seeks to prevent. Her thoughts were fragmented, oscillating rapidly between rationalizations and emotional responses. What will he think? Will he understand? Will he forgive? The mind races in these moments, creating hypothetical dialogues, rehearsing explanations, imagining consequences. The human brain is uniquely adept at constructing mental simulations of potential outcomes, sometimes accurately, sometimes catastrophically wrong. Meghan's inner world was a whirlwind of these simulations, each one amplified by love, fear, and the stakes of familial bonds. The emotional weight of secrecy is compounded when it intersects with intimacy. To love someone deeply is to desire their trust and acceptance. Yet, when one harbors a secret that could shatter that trust, the emotional tension becomes almost unbearable. Meghan's fictional perspective captures this tension, the simultaneous yearning to be understood and the fear of inevitable judgment. The conflict is both universal and acute, resonating with anyone who has navigated the treacherous terrain of honesty, omission, and vulnerability. In this scenario, she revisited countless interactions with Harry. Each memory was now refracted through the prism of potential exposure. Words once casual became loaded. Gestures once benign now suggested deeper implications. The mind has an almost cruel habit of retroactively assigning meaning to past events when confronted with new information. What was intended as a simple conversation can suddenly feel like evidence in a trial that exists only within the imagination. Her emotional state was punctuated by physical sensations. The tightening of the chest, the fluttering in the stomach, the shallow breathing that accompanies panic. Humans experience stress physiologically as well as psychologically, and in moments of moral or emotional jeopardy, the body mirrors the intensity of thought. In this fictionalization, these sensations heighten the drama and immerse the audience in the raw, visceral reality of facing potential exposure. Yet, amid the fear, there was also a strong impulse toward self-protection. Survival instincts kick in, often blending with the desire to preserve relationships. This duality, wanting to be honest, yet fearing the consequences of honesty, is central to human behavior in morally complex situations. Meghan's internal narrative demonstrates this tension vividly, showing the push and pull between confession and concealment, vulnerability and defense, love and self-preservation. Humor and irony, subtle but present, punctuate the narrative. She might internally critique the absurdity of human emotions, the way anticipation magnifies potential disaster, or the almost theatrical nature of thought patterns when confronted with life-altering information. These fleeting moments of levity, brief as they are, provide relief for both character and audience, while also deepening the realism of the emotional landscape. One of the key dynamics in this fictional perspective is the awareness of relational interdependence. Actions taken, or not taken, do not occur in isolation. Any move toward disclosure, evasion, or explanation will reverberate through the lives of others. Children, partners, even extended family are implicated, consciously or unconsciously. This creates a multidimensional pressure cooker where every decision carries layered consequences. In narrative terms, this complexity increases tension and retention, as viewers are compelled to anticipate not just one reaction, but multiple, intersecting ones. The anticipation of confrontation creates an almost unbearable suspense. Meghan, in this dramatization, imagines Harry reading the contents of the envelope, sees his facial expressions shift, feels the weight of potential disappointment, betrayal, and hurt. The human mind, when preparing for emotionally charged events, often exaggerates both danger and impact. This narrative device amplifies tension, keeping the audience engaged and emotionally invested. There is also the cognitive phenomenon of self-justification at play. She asks herself, why did I do this? Was it necessary? Could there have been a different choice? The internal monologue is a mix of reason and emotion, reflecting a struggle to reconcile past actions with present consequences. This self-reflection is compelling because it mirrors real human behavior. Most people attempt to rationalize morally ambiguous decisions, especially when stakes are high. Importantly, this chapter also explores the anticipation of emotional expression. Crying, confession, apology, these are not mere acts of release. They are social and relational signals, conveying vulnerability, remorse, and, potentially, a desire for forgiveness. In our fictional scenario, Meghan's preparation for such acts demonstrates awareness of their relational impact, even as fear and guilt dominate her immediate experience. The tension lies in whether these signals will achieve the intended effect or exacerbate the fracture already in progress. The narrative pacing reflects the emotional ebb and flow. Moments of intense internal dialogue are interspersed with brief sensory observations. The sound of footsteps outside, the shifting light through a window, the quiet ticking of a clock. These details anchor the audience in the present while allowing exploration of the inner landscape. Short, punchy sentences convey urgency. Longer, reflective passages convey depth and introspection. This variation in pacing is essential to maintaining engagement over long-form storytelling. And then comes the pivotal moment. The recognition that the envelope has been opened, the contents processed, and that Harry is now aware. This realization triggers a surge of dread. It is the fictional moment when anticipation collapses into inevitability. The internal narrative accelerates. How will he respond? What will be said? How will this redefine the bond between them? The stakes are existential, not in the literal sense, but in the emotional and relational dimensions that define human connection. As this chapter draws to a close, the tension is left unresolved. The audience is positioned at the precipice of confrontation, understanding the emotional stakes from both perspectives. Harry's shock and Meghan's apprehension are poised to intersect, setting the stage for dramatic engagement. But what came next would push them both to the edge, and no one saw it coming. The air in the room was heavy, almost viscous, as the words finally escaped. "I'm sorry I lied." In this fictionalized scenario, it was not shouted. It wasn't dramatic in a theatrical sense. It was whispered, fragile, trembling, the kind of admission that feels both necessary and terrifying. Confession is one of the most potent narrative tools because it carries emotional weight, moral stakes, and irreversible consequences all at once. These words, though few, resonated like a seismic tremor in a room already charged with tension. For Harry, the words were at once relieving and devastating. Relief, because finally, the unspoken doubt had been articulated. Devastating, because acknowledgement often crystallizes suspicion, confirming fears long simmering below the surface. In human psychology, confession is a double-edged sword. It promises clarity but also forces confrontation with the emotional consequences of past actions. In this fictional dramatization, Harry's mind raced to integrate this new information, to balance empathy with hurt, and to reconcile past experiences with this present reality. The statement itself was simple, yet the emotional subtext was vast. "I'm sorry I lied" implies acknowledgement of deception, recognition of harm caused, and, implicitly, request for forgiveness. The power of such a phrase lies in its ability to both open and close doors. It can invite reconciliation or deepen a rift. In this story, the phrase served as a turning point, a pivot between past misunderstandings and future uncertainty. Meghan's fictional inner world was a mix of dread and hope. Fear that the admission would irreparably fracture trust. Hope that honesty could heal the breach. Anxiety that vulnerability might be rejected entirely. The act of confessing is rarely about absolution. It is a negotiation with the other person's perception and capacity for understanding. In fictional storytelling, this moment magnifies tension because the audience recognizes the stakes. The delicate balance of human emotion is exposed, and any misstep could cascade into irreversible consequences. Harry's response was measured, yet charged. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken interpretations. He wasn't simply hearing the words, he was interpreting them, weighing intent, sincerity, and potential ramifications. Every microexpression, every subtle inflection, was analyzed and reanalyzed. Humans are wired to detect authenticity in moments of vulnerability. The slightest inconsistency can amplify doubt or suspicion. The audience, too, is drawn into this analytic tension, feeling the weight of both revelation and reception simultaneously. The confession also served as a mirror, reflecting the broader relational dynamics at play. It forced both characters to confront not only the act of deception itself, but also the underlying motivations, fears, and choices that led to it. In fiction, this layering of personal, relational, and psychological stakes enriches the narrative, providing depth and complexity beyond a simple admission of wrongdoing. Emotionally, the room shifted. The confession had created a new dynamic, a fragile equilibrium between vulnerability and guardedness. Harry was forced to consider not only the immediate implications of the lie, but also the broader context, the trust that had been eroded over time, the potential impact on future interactions, and the necessity of redefining boundaries and expectations. Meghan, in turn, experienced both relief and terror, relief that honesty was finally expressed, terror that it might not be enough. Humor, though subdued, emerged in brief, ironic moments. For example, Meghan internally noted the absurdity of rehearsing words she hoped would convey sincerity, only to have the emotional weight of the moment overwhelm her delivery. These flashes of self-awareness humanize characters, providing moments of connection for the audience while maintaining the overall tension of the narrative. Physiological reactions heighten the scene: shallow breathing, trembling hands, pounding heartbeats. The body often mirrors emotional intensity, and in storytelling, these physical cues enhance the realism and immersive quality of the narrative. The audience senses the weight of confession not just intellectually, but viscerally. Importantly, the confession functions as both revelation and challenge. While honesty is expressed, it demands a response. Forgiveness is not automatic. Trust is not immediately restored. The emotional terrain becomes a negotiation. How to integrate new knowledge, reassess past interactions, and navigate future relational dynamics. This complexity sustains engagement by highlighting uncertainty and the unpredictability of human response. In fictional dramatizations, the pacing of confession is critical. Short, impactful sentences convey urgency and immediacy. Longer, reflective passages allow the audience to dwell on the emotional gravity and internal deliberation of the characters. This interplay of pacing mirrors natural human cognition, alternating between rapid, reactive thought and slower, introspective processing. The narrative tension is further amplified by anticipation of consequences. Meghan's admission, while necessary, is not sufficient to resolve the underlying emotional fracture. The audience is acutely aware that acknowledgement is only the beginning. The ripples of this confession will extend outward, affecting trust, communication, and intimacy in ways both immediate and long-term. Conflict arises not only from the content of the confession, but also from its timing and context. Harry's interpretation of past events is now reframed. Gestures, words, and interactions that were previously benign are reevaluated under the lens of newly disclosed information. This retroactive reinterpretation is psychologically compelling, highlighting the power of information to reshape perception and memory. The chapter crescendos as both characters confront the implications of the admission. Silence and speech intermingle, punctuated by hesitation, reflection, and emotional fluctuation. The audience is positioned at the edge of understanding, aware that the next moments will determine the trajectory of their relationship. Finally, the chapter closes with a dramatic pause. The confession has been delivered, the emotional ground shifted, but resolution remains elusive. The audience is left suspended in anticipation, fully engaged in the psychological and relational consequences of the disclosure. But what came next would push them beyond words and force choices that neither could have anticipated, and no one saw it coming. In any story of revelation and confession, the immediate aftermath is rarely calm. Even after words are spoken, even after admissions are made, the real work begins, the fallout. In this fictional dramatization, the confession, "I'm sorry I lied," acted as both catalyst and lens, refracting every past interaction, every gesture, and every unspoken expectation through a prism of doubt, reassessment, and emotional recalibration. The envelope, the result, and the admission together had created a perfect storm, one that would sweep through every corner of their lives. Harry, in this scenario, was caught between relief and devastation. Relief, because the doubt that had haunted him for years was finally addressed. Devastation, because confirmation often sharpens the pain of suspicion. The human mind, confronted with betrayal, real or perceived, oscillates between processing factual information and reconciling emotional response. In this case, each revelation required him to reinterpret the past, question motives, and anticipate future dynamics. The emotional weight was profound, almost physically palpable. For Meghan, the fallout was a different but equally intense experience. She was acutely aware of the potential for escalation, misunderstanding, or rejection. The act of confession, while morally necessary, was not a panacea. It exposed vulnerability and invited judgment. Humans, in such moments, navigate an internal balancing act: honesty versus self-protection, remorse versus fear, hope versus anticipation of consequence. In fiction, exploring this duality creates tension that keeps the audience invested. One of the first ripple effects of the confession was the internal reinterpretation of memory. Every conversation, gesture, an event that had previously been neutral or ambiguous was now seen through the lens of new knowledge. The mind retroactively assigns significance, sometimes accurate, sometimes distorted by emotion. In this fictional narrative, Harry's recollection of past interactions with Meghan shifted subtly but profoundly. A phrase spoken casually years ago suddenly felt like a coded admission. A look once dismissed as neutral became suggestive. This process of reinterpretation is psychologically realistic and dramatically compelling, heightening the audience's anticipation. The emotional spectrum widened further with conflicting impulses. Anger, sorrow, relief, and empathy all vied for dominance. Harry experienced the tension of wanting to process the truth logically while being emotionally inundated. Humans are rarely purely rational in such moments. Emotion dominates perception, interpretation, and decision-making. In storytelling, this dynamic is essential. It keeps the narrative unpredictable and the audience engaged. Physical manifestations of stress amplified the drama. Restless pacing, tapping fingers, shallow breathing, and a general sense of kinetic unease mirrored internal turmoil. Such cues serve as both narrative and psychological devices, reinforcing the tension without the need for dialogue. The audience senses that the emotional landscape is volatile, fragile, and unpredictable. A secondary dimension of fallout is relational recalibration. Trust, once fractured, requires negotiation. Communication shifts, boundaries are redefined, and interactions are filtered through heightened awareness of potential deception. In this fictional scenario, the conversation following the confession was only the first step. The aftermath involved recalibrating assumptions, intentions, and emotional responses. Every action, word spoken, gesture made, glance exchanged, carries amplified significance. Humor, when it appears, is subtle and ironic, offering brief emotional reprieve. For instance, Meghan might internally note the absurdity of rehearsing a lifetime of explanations, only to realize that words cannot fully convey the emotional complexity of her actions. These moments humanize the characters while maintaining narrative tension. A key aspect of fallout is the ripple effect beyond the immediate parties. Children, family members, and even friends are indirectly affected. The knowledge of a lie or revelation alters dynamics, creates uncertainty, and requires emotional adaptation. In storytelling, extending the consequences beyond the central characters enriches the narrative, adding layers of complexity and relatability. The internal dialogue of both characters oscillates between reflection and projection. They anticipate reactions, imagine consequences, and struggle with hypothetical outcomes. In Harry's case, this includes considering whether he can continue to trust Meghan, how their relationship may evolve, and whether forgiveness is possible. In Meghan's case, anticipation involves predicting acceptance, rejection, or conditional forgiveness. This interplay sustains dramatic tension and keeps the audience emotionally invested. Emotionally charged flashbacks serve as narrative devices in this chapter. Scenes from the past, arguments, reconciliations, intimate moments, are reinterpreted in light of new knowledge. These flashbacks deepen character development, provide insight into relational history, and heighten audience engagement by layering past and present simultaneously. The fallout also includes moral reckoning. Both characters are forced to confront the ethical dimensions of honesty, omission, and responsibility. They must decide which principles take precedence: self-protection, relational preservation, or absolute transparency. The audience is drawn into this moral calculus, reflecting on their own potential choices in analogous situations. As the chapter progresses, tension escalates with each passing moment. The emotional landscape is not static. It fluctuates unpredictably, reflecting real human responses to revelation and confession. Moments of calm are brief and fragile, immediately replaced by waves of reflection, doubt, and emotional processing. This ebb and flow create narrative momentum, sustaining long-form engagement. The chapter closes with a lingering sense of uncertainty. The confession has been made. The revelation has been acknowledged. Yet resolution remains elusive. Both characters are left to navigate a new emotional terrain, fraught with ambiguity, vulnerability, and the potential for further fracture. But what came next would test their resilience, challenge their bonds, and push the consequences of truth into uncharted territory, and no one saw it coming. The fallout of revelation is rarely contained to private spaces. In this fictionalized scenario, the tension that had built quietly between Harry and Meghan began to seep outward, touching the edges of their social world, their public perception, and even the imagined stability of family life. Secrets, once revealed, act like a contagion. They spread, refract, and amplify in ways that are often unpredictable. For Harry, the emotional landscape shifted again. The private confrontation, the whispered apology, and the weight of the envelope had created an intimate storm. But the broader consequences, the potential for exposure beyond their room, added an additional layer of pressure. Even when one believes a confession is contained, the ripple effects extend. The fear that private truths might become public knowledge compounds stress, creating a dual tension: personal resolution versus public consequence. In this chapter, the narrative explores the psychological phenomenon of anticipatory stress. Harry imagined the eyes of the world watching, the whispers of friends or family speculating, and the relentless gaze of social media as if it were an omnipresent force. Even in fiction, this reflects real human experience. The anticipation of judgment often outweighs the event itself in emotional intensity. The tension is psychological, relational, and social, layering the drama for the audience. Meanwhile, Meghan wrestled with guilt and anxiety in amplified ways. The apology had been delivered, yet she could not control its reception, interpretation, or downstream consequences. Her internal monologue is rich with hypothetical scenarios. How might Eliza respond? Could a misstep exacerbate harm? Is there a way to regain trust? In fictional storytelling, this internalized tension creates suspense and empathy for the audience, who are invited to inhabit her conflicted emotional world. The dynamics between them are further complicated by the awareness of long-term implications. Trust, once fractured, cannot simply be repaired with words. It must be rebuilt through consistent actions, transparency, and sometimes sacrifice. Harry, in this dramatization, begins to consider boundaries. What can be forgiven, what must be observed, and what might be irrevocable. These reflections deepen character complexity and maintain audience investment by raising stakes beyond immediate emotional reactions. As the story unfolds, past events are retroactively examined. Gestures, statements, and decisions that once seemed inconsequential now take on new significance. Memory is reframed through the lens of revelation. This cognitive reappraisal is a natural psychological response, adding depth and realism to the narrative. Harry notices subtle inconsistencies in Meghan's past statements, minor hesitations, and moments that previously passed without comment. Each memory is a puzzle piece recontextualized by the new truth. Simultaneously, Meghan navigates a self-reflective spiral. She imagines how different audiences, family, friends, and even the public in this fictionalized account might interpret her actions. The act of confession, while morally necessary, exposes her to scrutiny and judgment. Her emotional state oscillates between hope for understanding and dread of rejection, highlighting the complexity of human morality and relational repair. The chapter emphasizes nonverbal communication, which often carries as much weight as dialogue in emotional scenarios. Shifts in posture, gaze, tone, and facial expression become magnified. Harry's tightening of the jaw, Meghan's fidgeting hands, and the silent pauses between sentences communicate as much as their spoken words. This attention to detail enriches the narrative, engaging the audience by simulating the subtle cues they would perceive in real life. Humor emerges intermittently as a coping mechanism. Meghan might internally note the irony of planning explanations that ultimately feel inadequate, or the absurdity of imagining a perfect resolution when reality is so complex. These moments of levity humanize the characters and provide temporary relief from emotional intensity, making the narrative more relatable and engaging. A key narrative element in this chapter is relational recalibration. Both characters begin to test boundaries and assess the resilience of trust. Harry is attentive to inconsistencies, tone, and sincerity, while Meghan monitors her own emotional responses and readiness to be fully transparent. This negotiation process, though subtle, is critical to sustaining tension. Every interaction carries weight, and the audience anticipates potential missteps that could escalate conflict or catalyze reconciliation. The emotional landscape is further complicated by the introduction of external pressures. In this fictionalized account, media attention, public scrutiny, and imagined familial judgment serve as additional stressors. While these elements are not the primary focus, they heighten the stakes, reflecting the real-world complexity of personal revelations occurring within social contexts. Flashbacks are employed strategically to deepen the narrative. Past conflicts, reconciliations, and intimate moments are revisited, reframed by current knowledge. Each flashback adds context, clarifies motivation, and heightens emotional resonance, allowing the audience to understand the depth of relational disruption caused by the revelation. The chapter crescendos as both characters confront the reality that secrets, once spilled, cannot be contained. The private drama now edges toward broader relational and social implications, increasing tension and anticipation. The audience is left on edge, waiting for the consequences of truth to unfold fully. But what came next would thrust them into a confrontation with reality beyond their control, forcing choices that would redefine relationships entirely, and no one saw it coming.